Monday Night Football.
Okay, gentlemen, on 10. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark McCullough. I'm the Vice President of the Clinton County Historical Association. I'd like to welcome you all this evening for what should be a very entertaining and enjoyable program having to do with early radio in Clinton County. I'd like to thank you all for coming out on this spring evening, fighting the weather. Fortunately, we don't have any ice out there to deal with, or at least in small patches. And anyone going to talk about early weather radio? Maybe you can give us some insight into the weather.
But better then than it is now.
These gentlemen here, I don't know if I need to introduce them, but allow me one moment, and I'd like to start from my left and work to my right. We have George Bissell, who I should indicate is still the current owner. He is not the former owner.
They didn't tell you, George, right?
That's right,
It's going to be a tough crowd.
Gordie called up and he said, how did you all at the association scoop us on that story? We didn't even know about that. And then we have Gordie Little to his right, from WIRY, Wiry, Michael Mannix, and Chet Bosworth, also from Wiry Radio. What I'm going to do at this point in time is, before we get into the program, I'd like to introduce Helen Allen, our curator and director of the Historical Association, who will take but a few moments to talk about a few business items. And then we're going to turn it over to George, who will act as the MC for this evening's program. Thank you again for coming.
And for the first 5 lucky people, I have 5 signed copies. The price on the book was $7.95 through December 31st, but for your special benefit, we will retain that price tonight. Then it goes up to $8.95. This is Alan's book. He put a tremendous amount of effort into it. It's very nice, and I do have some copies here this evening. Just one quick thing that I thought you folks might like to know. When you leave tonight, we did help to design it just a little bit with some input from various people in the association. I think we probably will be asked to provide displays in it on historical themes. It's almost completed, so as you go by, peek through the plastic, and you'll see where we might in the future be installing some exhibits.
George, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mark. I'm very impressed with the attendance tonight. I certainly wasn't expecting such an overwhelming showing. I guess the fact that there's no more Monday Night Football brought something. Especially Wayne. Glad you didn't sit in the front row, Wayne, because the lights are shining off your forehead there. I couldn't pass that cheap shot out. It's certainly a pleasure for me to appear with such a distinguished panel. I'm very proud of the radio industry and what the local stations have done to enhance the image of radio, especially in the North Country and even throughout the United States. And I'm the only bean counter here tonight. Everybody else is, in our business we have management and we have what we call talent. So everything to my right is talent. And if they work for you, you call them something else, but if they work for the competition, you call them talent. And I'm the only one here who, unfortunately, has not had the opportunity to work for both radio stations in the city. My father, I was the only person my father has never fired, but he tried. He was on the verge several times. But, and maybe that was a misfortune to some extent, because that was usually how somebody got their big start in radio when my father fired him. In fact, Ben Turnbull, who was a publisher of the Press Republican, was fired twice in 1 week. he went on to much bigger and much better things, and when he came back to Plattsburgh in the 60s, it took us a while to become friends again, but he was able to forget that, and I reminded him how much better off he was, rather than making $120 a week as an announcer, to be making $120,000 a year as a publisher of the Press Republican.
$125 a week?
My dad, I guess I'd like to start, I'd kind of like to do a chronological narrative of what's happened in radio from way before my time to maybe the present time. I am not clear at all on a lot of my facts. I'm sure that there are people in the audience who can correct me, and I would be more than willing to be corrected. I'm not trying to date anyone for sure, but I didn't have a chance to really research this as well as I should have. I hate to admit I was a history major in college, and I never thought I'd have to call on that part of my education in the future. I went to history because I didn't want to get into communications. It looked too hard. So I guess the repercussions, or the chickens are coming home to roost. My dad, I think what you're going to hear tonight, at least for me anyway, is that there have been 3 or 4 individuals who have headed up the various broadcast organizations. In fact, there's probably not more than 5 from the ownership standpoint. And my dad was probably one of the first. He started in radio in Tupper Lake, New York in the 20s. His family ran a appliance store, and these new things came out called radios, and he was trying to sell them, but he couldn't demonstrate them because there's no radio stations around. So we got the smart idea of saying, gee, you know, if I start a radio station, and you didn't have to run a radio station those days 24 hours or any extended, I mean, you could sign it on when you wanted and sign it off when you wanted, run it an hour or 2 hours or whenever you got tired. So he figured he'd be able to sell more radios if he had a radio station to demonstrate them. And that's kind of how he got into the radio business. And he founded a station, WHDL, in Tupper Lake, New York. I know it was in the 1920s. We have his original license posted at our radio station now. We also have the revocation of his license from that wasn't the Federal Communications Commission, and that was, I think it was the Federal Radio Commission in the early days, but apparently they found something they didn't like about what he was doing and revoked his license. He was smart enough to get the license back again, and he continued on. From Tupper Lake, he went down to Glens Falls and founded a station. Actually, it was in Hudson Falls, WGLC. The call letters had some significance in that they stood for the Griffin Lumber Company, which I understand was a going concern in Hudson Falls. And I'm sure they had a lot of money in the radio station, so they were able to call it what they wanted. And in the early 30s, apparently he found some interest back in the Plattsburgh area for a radio station. 2 local businessmen, Ed and Les Bragg, who owned Bragg Brothers, which is an appliance store. I believe the last time I recall, it was at the corner across from where Arnie's is today, and I was going to say State Bank, but it's Fleet Bank. Everything is changing, or North Star. I don't know. You got to come.
Albany Savings.
Albany Savings.
Next to the Winter Hotel. Let's get back to Winter.
Okay, next. I'm glad. Yes, next to the Witherell Hotel. That's where they had an appliance store. Ed and Les were the original owners, along with my father, and it says A.H. Marshall Company. Now, I don't know if that was an individual or whether the company was Mr. Marshall.
Albert Marshall.
Albert Marshall. He apparently had some money in it as well. I know my father had to go outside the area. He went down to Ausable Forks. He didn't have the financing I think that he needed to start a station. So I think he spoke with a Mr. Rogers, as I recall. I'm not absolutely positive, but I know Mr. Rogers interviewed him as to whether he was worthy enough to run a radio station, and because that was a relatively new experience in those days, and Mr. Rogers apparently was convinced, as his controller was not, that my father was an honorable man, and my father, I remember, never forgot that favor, because that's what launched him. The original station was called WMFF. It was an AM radio station. It signed on the air in 1935. It was a Sunday afternoon, as I am told, at 3 o'clock. I don't know what the weather was, but the original studios were in the Cumberland Hotel. The Cumberland Hotel is where the parking lot is across from the government center. If you follow the history of our radio stations, you're going to find a lot of vacant lots, a lot of moving. So far, we've been one step ahead of the demolition ball, but I don't know how long that'll continue. The original frequency was 1310 kilohertz, or kilocycles in those days, and it was an amazing power of 100 watts. There were so few radio stations in those days that 100 watts got you out quite a ways. They tell of reports now. The reliability I would never believe, even today on reception reports from any radio station, but they said they heard us in Montreal and in New Hampshire, and even down in New Jersey. And that's possible with 100 watts. With 100 watts today, you couldn't hear yourself in Keysville probably, because there's so many stations on the spectrum. But radio did get out quite a ways in those days, because the band wasn't as crowded as it is today. Doing some very limited research, as Claire Gweno knows how much I like not to work in advance. I did some research, and the original call letters were supposed to be WBBZ. This is the first time, to my knowledge, I have ever heard that, but it was in print, and it was in the Tupper Lake newspaper, so I'm sure that it's absolutely accurate. But I don't know why those call letters weren't acceptable and why they were changed to WMFF, but that's the way it was, as Walter Cronkite would say. In the programming, I'm not sure what they did for programming, because it isn't like today where you have records and tape recorders and cart machines and compact discs and things of that nature. It was basically kind of, you got a piano player, you brought in a live band. It was pretty much the way television is today. The main programming happened to come from a network or a transcription service, which is a fancy word for records, and they would put programs on records, and then you would fill in with local news and local programming. But I would say the majority of the programming, even in the early days, was done from the networks or through records. In 1938, the station joined the NBC radio network. I believe it was the Blue Network. In those days, I think there were 3 networks. There was CBS, there was the NBC Red, and the NBC Blue. At that point, I guess the networks could own, you could have 2 network services. Later became an FCC, or Federal Communications Commission policy, that you could only operate 1 network, and then in the 60s, the FCC relented again, and then they let networks run several networks, and some are running as many as 10 networks today. That was a big thing, because NBC was a nationally known network, and it kind of put us on the map. Sometime in the 1940s, and I don't know what it had to be kind of like, because during the war, I don't think anybody could do anything as far as in replacing equipment or improving facilities or applying for new stations. So I'm pretty sure the period of 1940 to 1945, very few radio stations did anything but keep the transmitters operating with baling wire and chewing gum. And then in 1945, war materials, I'm sorry, you have a question?
I can tell you one thing that they did have. They had equipment so that records could be made, and then after they were played, they were heated up and done again. My father had a regular program. He was brought in by your father.
Okay, that's what they used to do. Is I had a call, by the way, a couple of weeks ago. Somebody was asking whether I had any tapes of radio programs in the 1940s. And I said, ma'am, they didn't have tape recorders in those days. I think the first thing to come out were wire recorders. And then before that, what we did is we had record cutters, and you would make a transcription or a record. Similar though, to the way you do a tape recording today, only the stylus would cut the, what's that material? What do you, wax, whatever. Yeah, and it was metal backing, so you had to be careful you didn't run your needle down too fast because you would ruin the needle. And there were big transcriptions. There were 16-inch transcriptions, and they were played on 78 revolutions per second, per minute. Too fast. I know you're going to get that. Okay. Very good. So there we are with the transcriptions and the early history of the technology that radio stations had to use. And it was very difficult. I mean, announcers read commercials live. They did. There was things called a broadcast book, which would probably be that thick. And everything that was said virtually on the radio station that day would be put in chronological order and be formatted. The announcers would read this live. And today, things are almost exclusively on tape or extemporaneous, but there's very little advanced warning as to what you're supposed to say or how you're supposed to lead into a program. In the late 40s, WMFF apparently increased their power from 250 watts to 1,000 watts. And they had to switch to 1340 kilocycles from 1310. I don't know exactly the dates that happened, but I know it had to happen because of what happened subsequently in the history of the radio stations. Also, in 1948, WMFF changed the call letters to WEAV. The reason, as far as I am told, and my father said, nobody could really spit out the call letters WMFF all that well, so that they felt it was easier to say WEAV. As I said, the powers increased to 1,000 watts. We changed from, and at 1948, we changed from 1340 kilohertz, or kilocycles in the early days, they changed that in the 50s, to 960 kilohertz, which really left the channel available, and that's how WIRY happened to come on the scene. In 1948, we also affiliated with ABC. I'm not sure of that date, but I know the NBC Blue network eventually became the ABC network. In 1951, WIRY applied for the when we vacated the 1340 frequency. Joel Shire, who was a general manager, up until the point that my father learned that he was applying for WIRY anyways, applied for the vacated frequency of 1340, and that was signed on in 1951, and they had 250 watts. They were located in the same building that they're located in today, and that was a full-time radio station. One of the interesting early things I noticed, and I've got a little book that I'll pass around after if you want to look through. It shows it was nicely done. I'm not sure of the year, but it had to be in the early 40s, judging from how big my ears were. But I'll pass that around, and you can look at it. Gives you an interesting look at the way a radio station functioned in the mid-40s. At some point, our original transmitter site, by the way, and I'm just trying to recall all this because it doesn't come up very often. Our original transmitter site was on Boynton Avenue, just at the base of the hill, and it was sort of a top hat, a circle around it. It looked like a little halo around the top of the tower. What that did actually is did not help us with the Almighty all that much. It was simply to give the tower a little more power and radiate a little more signal. But apparently, from what I read at the time, that original tower was relatively new technology. It was called the vertical tower, which, you know, it's pretty obvious it was vertical. I don't know what they used before that, but apparently it wasn't vertical. I've never known too many towers to be anything other than vertical. Tower is a tower, you know. However, now at some point, and maybe Claire would know this better than I would, or maybe several of you know this better than I would, the studios were moved from Cumberland Hotel over to Margaret Street, atop of the E.S. Mason building. Does anybody recall that date at all?
It was before 1950.
No.
Well, I came to work at WEAV after they had moved in there just short, and that was in 1948. So they were there in 1948 at any rate.
1948.
But this was just a few months before I came.
Okay. So apparently we moved over to the studios. Was it 153 Margaret Street? Anyways, it's the corner of Cornelia Street and Margaret, and it was the upstairs. It was known as the E.S. Mason building. They had a car dealership downstairs. In 1955, Plattsburgh Air Force Base came to the community, and they wanted to put a runway where our towers were. Our towers had subsequently, when we increased our power to 1,000 watts, had been moved from Boynton Avenue to where the Bible Baptist Church is, I believe now. That was our former transmitter site, which is about in back of where DeRocha Lincoln Mercury is. That was an open field, and we erected 3 self-supporting towers, and the station's transmitter was located at that point. The air base wanted that land, and they were going to get that land, and they were going to get it in a hurry, and they wanted us to move. So where we had to move was at our current location, which is on the Lakeshore Road just south of Ausable Point, and it's about 8 miles south of the city. The FCC had a ruling, and still does, that a radio station to serve its city of license, which would be Plattsburgh, had to put 25 millivolts over the city of Plattsburgh. 25 millivolts, I don't know, it's just a certain power. I've never seen a millivolt in my life. I've definitely seen them on meters, and you had to have 25, and that had to be over the city of license, and the center of the city of license was theoretically your post office. So for us to put that amount of power over the city of Plattsburgh, we had to be increased to 5,000 watts. But the FCC wasn't going to allow that, because that channel was not allowed to go to anything more than 1,000 watts. Well, I got a quick education, or at least my father found out, and maybe, I'm sure Claire Gweno was here at the time, and she realized that the Defense Department had a heck of a lot more to say about how stations were allocated than the Federal Communications Commission, because I understand that application went to the FCC and was ramrodded through in lightning time, and it was approved, and the existing towers were torn down, and the station was moved onto the Lakeshore Road. At that point, I believe we also moved our studios from the E.S. Mason building over to 38 Court Street, which is approximately where we're sitting now. So they kept trying to get us farther and farther out of town, and they were succeeding move by move. And that was a great building. Really enjoyed. It was a very convenient building. It was an historic building. It's too bad that several of those buildings did have to be leveled, but we can see what's here now, and I guess the county wanted their space, and that's the way it was going to happen. In 1960, we signed on WEAV FM, which was at 99.9. It's still our current dial position, and it was 3,700 watts or 3.7 kilowatts, which is a relatively low-powered FM station. The idea of that station was never to be a radio station because FM was not viable at that time. What happened was that the government, and I'm throwing these historical tidbits in here because I know you're all great historians and probably haven't heard some of these stories, but we had the Air Force agreed to pay for a link between our studios and our transmitter, which was on Lakeshore Road, and they were going to put a microwave link in and a telephone line so that the studio was connected with the transmitter, and one was to act as a backup. But they couldn't make a microwave work. So my father said, well, you know, I'll put an FM station on the air and we'll use that as the backup. The government said, hey, it's taxpayers' money, go ahead. You know? And it was relatively cheap in those days to run an FM station, and you didn't have to worry too much about it because nobody really listened to FM in those days. What little we knew at that point. So we actually became the first FM station in the Champlain Valley. That same year, WIRY increased their power to 1,000 watts, and they became a directional radio station. Now, if you're familiar with a tower, a non-directional station will radiate a signal almost in a circular fashion. I mean, there will be various types of terrain that will tend to hinder that, but essentially it'll be a circle. A directional radio station consists of more than one tower, up to maybe 14, depending on what your finances are and what you want your pattern to do. And the current is fed to the towers in the various phase and power relationship, which makes the signal almost in a very predictable fashion. So, you know, you might have a figure 8. You might have one side of the tower might not have any power. You can really customize a signal, and a lot of radio stations were allocated facilities simply on the fact that they could shoehorn their signal into a community by using directional antenna systems. YRA had 2 towers, and they were located essentially on the property that they're still occupying. In 1961, I'm sorry, in 1955, the original owners of WIRY were Joel Shire, and as I understand it, V.S. Jerry had money in it, and Dr. McDowell. That's the way I recall that the original corporation was set up. They also pioneered, and I know the topic isn't television, but they also applied for a television station which was originally WIRI and later became WPTZ. It was not a great economic success in the early days because television took a while to hit its stride, but when it did, it did. But it was a great pioneering effort. My father also applied for a station that was channel 28, which would have been a UHF station. And we never went through with that application, as had we done that, UHF would have had a very difficult time competing with a VHF television station and probably would have gone broke. So I'll credit him with knowing when not to go ahead. In 1961, Joel Shire sold WIRY to Charlie Britt and Don Pelkey. I think Charlie Britt owned the majority of the stock and Don Pelkey the minority interest. In 1965, WEAV-FM pioneered stereo broadcasting operations. The first station in the United States to go stereo, and the station that really pioneered it was WGY, or WGFM actually, it was our FM counterpart in Schenectady, New York. The General Electric developed the system, and I think there was a station in Chicago that was also one of the first FM stations. And I think the first stereo FM station was probably went on the air in 1962, and we picked up in 1965. And we had some problems with it originally because we had the stereo phase reverse, so instead of having separation we had compression. And in fact, it shows how local stations work together. The chief engineer of WIRY at the time came down and said, you know, there's something wrong with your stereo. He says, you ought to check this out. And we did, and we got it squared away. But we were the first. Belatedly, we got it working right. In 1968, WKDR signed on the air at 1070 kilohertz. There were 5,000 watts, and they were a daytime station, which meant that they had to sign on with the sunrise and sign off with sunset, local sunrise and sunset. That's a terrible handicap for any radio station because you really, in the wintertime, you'll lose your morning drive, and it's hard to establish a real pattern of local news. And they've had some good people in their time, but that has been the big problem with that facility. It's never been able to achieve what it probably should. Its signal is very good, the dial position is very good, but they're very limited. And the reason that they have daytime facilities is that the FCC in later years opened up some frequencies that some so-called clear channel. A clear channel radio station is one that there's nobody else on that frequency. And they broke those down in the 60s and 70s, so they allowed other radio stations to operate them, but they couldn't operate them on a nighttime basis simply because of the skywave radio propagation waves. The station goes much farther at night than it does in the daytime, so it's kind of a different animal. I never quite understood why it did that, but engineers tell me it does. So they were restricted to a daytime operation. The original owners were Peter Gibbard, Dan Jerry, Bill Levy, and Roger Forrence. Roger owned the land, I think, that the station was located on. Their studios were at the head of Margaret Street, head of Bridge Street on Margaret Street, and their transmitter location was on the Lappin Mills Road, which is a couple of miles from our tower site, south of the city. In 1973, we changed our call letters from WEAV-FM to WGFB. They were done simply to honor my father's initials, which were GFB. He was George F. Bissell, and I'm a junior, and there's a third and a fourth. So, not too much thinking in this family, I guess. Or maybe we know a good thing. But anyways, that's where the call letters came from there. And we moved the transmitter. In 1973, the county decided they wanted us completely out of town because they were going to move us out of here. And we had to move our FM tower site was located right at this point, and it was moved to property we owned on Rand Hill, which gave us much better coverage because in FM you want to have, the higher your tower is, the more coverage you have. FM is more or less line of sight. Radio tends to follow the curvature of the earth much better. We also moved our studios to the Lakeshore Road where our transmitter is, so that everything from the AM standpoint was in one building on the Lakeshore Road, and our FM was remote controlled and studio transmitter linked or microwave linked for our programming to Rand Hill. In 1976, Don Pelkey bought out Charlie Britt and became the sole owner. Late in the 70s, I'm not sure of the date, WIRY became a full-time non-directional radio station, which means they could eliminate one of their towers, and maybe that was 68, I'm not sure. I asked their chief engineer today, he he wasn't exactly sure, but in any event, they became 1,000 watts non-directional, and they were able to eliminate one tower, and it gave them a much better signal nighttime and daytime. Well, not necessarily daytime, but they didn't have to worry about the maintenance of a directional antenna. And these are problems because you have to paint towers, you have to replace guy wires, and you have to light them, and the less equipment you have, the better off you are. In 1979, WGFB increased its power to 10,000 watts. That gave us, when I kick these powers around, it's not like we were 10 times more powerful. That might be roughly twice as powerful, 10 kilowatts. And in AM radio, a 1,000 watt station or a 5,000 watt station might be, it has 5 times the power, but maybe only twice the coverage, and a 50,000 watt radio station. Well, that's pretty big stuff. If you got a 50,000 watt AM radio station and you've got the right frequency, you can go a long ways. But you know, you're going to have one heck of a power bill too. You couldn't operate something like that in Plattsburgh and make it viable. In 1987, WKDR was sold to Roger Jakubowski. The Gibberts got out of the radio business, and Roger Jakubowski bought the station. In 1989, our FM station increased its power to 100 kilowatts and made NYSEG extremely happy. And I just every month I get that power bill. That wakes me right up. Our coverage roughly is the same with 100 kilowatts on FM as it is with 5 kilowatts on AM. So it's not like we go everywhere and do everything. It is the most powerful FM station you can own and operate today. There are more powerful ones that are grandfathered. CKVL in Montreal is 317,000 watts, and FM just doesn't carry like AM. So AM radio is a great facility, and it's a great way to broadcast. Unfortunately, what the commission has done is that they've let so many stations on the dial, it has tended to cause a lot of interference, and there also are technical reasons why AM radio is having some problems today. Fluorescent lights and things of that nature tend to affect AM radio where it doesn't affect FM. And the last item I had on my agenda is that in 1990 WKDR was sold to some Burlington interests. The station is still operating on Lappin's Mills Road, but the interests have just recently bought WDOT, which I understand will probably, that's a full-time facility, and they will probably operate that. What the future will be for WKDR, whether they will continue, I know the station has been for sale, whether they will continue to operate it with separate programming in Plattsburgh, I'm not sure. They are authorized, there's a new policy with the Federal Communications Commission they've just authorized, and that's called a duopoly, where you can own several stations. This was prohibited in the past. Other than an AM-FM combination, you can now own several AMs or several FMs or AM-FM combinations in the same market, which is a new policy with the FCC. So that is not so much of a nutshell, but that's kind of what's happened in radio. I haven't referred to public broadcasting. I believe they started a couple years ago with the WCFE-FM, and they broadcast a full schedule, and they have now joined. There's also a religious station in Cooperville, New York, which is 20,000 watts at a really very good dial position, but I think essentially their program is geared more toward Montreal and to the North Country. I don't think they have much programming other than syndicated or taped programming. All right, now take out your pens, we'll give you a test. I just want to give you some advice. Don't buy into a radio station right now. It's not a healthy market. And I only agreed to speak about the history of radio. I don't want to speak about the future of it because I'm not sure what's really going on right now. The technology is moving so fast. The government is involved in to such an extent that the past, even with all the problems that we've tended to forget, seems to be a rosy time indeed. There's one thing I do want to mention, and that's the fact of women in radio. You know, during the war, there were some outstanding women who were not only behind the scenes operators. The women functioned as engineers. They functioned as announcers. They did virtually everything. And Claire Gweno can speak to that too. She in effect virtually ran the radio station for several years, and she's associated with both WEAV and WKDR, and was one of the most overqualified people in her field that I have ever met. They did a tremendous job, but it wasn't for some reason. There's been a prevailing feeling that women should not be on the air. Men won't listen to women on the radio. Then all of a sudden the government decides that, well, you know, you're not going to be given a choice. We've got to have more women involved and minorities involved in broadcasting. And there's an equal opportunity program that was implemented in the 70s, 80s, and they're following through in the 90s, where women have been reintroduced to radio, both on the air, in management, in ownership, and especially in sales. I would think that there are probably more women selling radio advertising in the United States and even locally than there are men. So it's, and they've been very successful. They've been highly motivated, and it's one area that I certainly I've been very impressed. I don't know why the feeling was ever there. But I guess that maybe there's a mentality in the war years that, you know, women wanted to, they reigned the country for 5 years. When the men came home, maybe they figured they all wanted to go home and have children and get the economy moving. But we lost a lot of good people by the fact that they didn't continue in radio at those. And I know I'm not going to mention some names because there are so many names. That there's a Winnie Provo, Hortense Graves, Betty Krause. These are the names I can remember. I've mentioned Claire. In today's radio, my wife Judy, who's sitting in the audience, is our sales manager, and she's doing an excellent job in a very competitive market. So women have been very capable workers in radio, and they've certainly added to any success that we may have had. Now, I have just about exhausted all my knowledge, and I know Chet has to get up early in the morning. I would hope that I could introduce Chet Bosworth as someone none of you knew, because it would mean you didn't listen to that station. Unfortunately, he seemed to get a lot of recognition, and I've gotten to peek at surveys from time to time, and I know he has more than his family listening to him.
They don't listen.
Chet is one of the great things that happens to radio and local radio, because believe me, anybody can put out a signal. There's a lot of fine signals that come into the Plattsburgh area, but one of the great things about radio is a localism and what a person gives to its community, or gives to his or her community. And not only Chet, but the other three panelists up here have given of their time and their effort. There hasn't been the financial rewards that go with the time and the abilities that these gentlemen have. I can assure you that. I've been reminded of that many times in management. But one of the truly nice people, and a person who I've always been proud to serve with in the Plattsburgh area, has been a Chet Bosworth. He has been in radio. When did you say you started? 1948, Chet?
Yeah, up here, yes.
He's worked for both WEAV and WIRY. He's been in management, he's been in programming, and I think he's even been in sales.
Oh boy, yes.
I don't think he's been in engineering, which means he's a little smarter than maybe some of us. But he's a person I greatly respect, and I'd certainly like to hear what he would have to say about the early days of radio. Chet?
Thank you, George. I appreciate that. I got started in radio when I was in high school in St. Petersburg, and that was in 1939, if I remember. 1938, I guess. But anyway, when I went into the Navy and managed to get back into it after I got out for some reason or other, mainly because I needed a job, and we were living in Syracuse, and I saw an ad in Broadcasting Magazine, the organ for radio broadcasting, at WEAV in Plattsburgh needed an announcer. So I applied, and I came over and was interviewed by Martin D. Mannix, the father of our panelist here. I'm sure many of you people remember Martin Mannix. He was perhaps the most amazing participant in radio broadcasting that this community has seen. When Martin Mannix went on the air with the news, nobody was doing anything else but listening to the news. He had a way of putting things that irritated an awful lot of people. But at least they were listening. He took me into his office, and when I first came up, I understand that I was the second person he hired. When I first talked to him, he told me, I think you've got the job, but I have to interview some other people, and so you go back to Syracuse and I'll get in touch with you. And I got a letter saying that they'd hired another fellow who was more experienced. And then I got another telephone call from him saying, we've decided to hire 2 announcers, come on back. Well, it's turned out that the other fellow didn't work out. He was one of these, you might say, itinerant broadcasters who went from place to place and was very good. He was very good. Unfortunately, he also had a very good elbow. He didn't last long. So Martin took me home that evening, and I had dinner with the Mannixes, 7 of them, 7 kids sitting around the table.
You stayed, huh? Did you stay?
I sure stayed, yes. It was a free dinner. Trudy Mannix served as one of the great ladies of all time. She tried, oh, she tried. And, but that was the way it was with the radio station then, and I managed to stay there for a couple of years. Bert Berdan was on the air with me at that time also, and as a matter of fact, his wife, Dot, was one of the engineers that you're talking about, George. She ran the operation from out at the where the Bible Baptist Church is now, running the records. Well, we could tell many stories, of course, about things that went wrong with broadcasting in those days, because we all were high-spirited and had a lot of fun, and it drove George Bissell crazy. I remember sitting in the studios up here. The control room was in one room, and then there were 2 studios in a row, a small announcer studio, and then the main studio that you would look through and see through 2 different windows. And when I first went on the air, sitting at the console, I'm broadcasting and working, and all of a sudden I see something zip by in this little studio, and I thought, what was that? And it was dark in there, so I got up and I looked, but I couldn't see anything, and I sat down, and pretty soon, zip, something went back that way. So I went out in the hall and I looked around, but by that time he'd zipped back in again. So I finally went out and I looked in the door to see who was there, and here was this little face looking up at me. So I said to somebody, "Who's that little kid in there?" Well, he said, "That's Georgie Bissell." That's the boss's son. You'll see a lot of him. That was the first time that we met. I don't know if you remember that, George. But then Martin Mannix went to WIRY, and eventually, after WIRY went on the air about 2 years, 1 year after I had come to town, and about 2 years after that, I went up there too. And Martin Mannix had sort of a feud, you might say, with the mayor of the city, Jack Tyrrell. Jack Tyrrell was a mayor, I think, for about 18 years. And the city chamberlain at the time was J. Omer LaPlante, who was doing the news for WIRY. And he and Martin were not good friends at all. And at night, J. Omer would come on with the 6 o'clock news, and then Martin would come on at 6:30. And he would refute everything that J. Omer had said. And it really, if you were in the same studio with both of them when they were getting their newscasts ready, it was really an experience. I was the announcer at the time for both of them. And I would sometimes wonder if they were going to come to blows. They never did. But it was interesting to hear them. And it was the sort of thing that got WIRY back on the track, because for a while, Wiry did not have a very easy time of it. Everything that we had on the air was modeled on what had been on at WEAV, and the reason for that was that Betty Swift, or Betty Krause as she later was named, had set up both stations for their formats. There was midday melodies on WEAV at noon, and when Wiry went on the air, it was noon tunes. A little jazzier. They had, there were other programs that that escaped me that I can't remember now, but the one thing that Wiry did also was to have a religious program on in the morning. Morning devotions, they called it, which was well named, I guess. And all of the Protestant churches and the Jewish temple also participated in this. Later on, we had the saying of the Rosary at night for the Catholic audience, which in those days was much bigger than the Protestant audience. I'm not sure how it ranks now, but for years the morning devotions program was on, and I got to meet an awful lot of preachers just by introducing. I mean, they all became good friends, because for a week the Methodist Church would be on, for another week the Baptist Church, and then the next week it would be another, and you met all of these ministers, and you knew them and knew their families. It was the thing about Wiry, I think, was it was a family kind of an attraction for people. I would like to tell one little story about Martin Mannix, and then I will defer to my colleagues here. Martin, as we mentioned earlier, as George mentioned earlier, the commercials were all read live. There was very little recorded unless it was a national account. Wiry did not have too many national accounts. But we would read the commercials, and the book was set up every day by Esther Fox, who was our copywriter. And sometimes Esther would get a little tired writing new copy every time that came in, and so she would make little changes, put little carrots in here and add a word up above. And if somebody wanted to say something a little different in the commercial, she would put a little carrot down here and add it in. And there was a Marshall store that you mentioned earlier, had a gift shop up on the mezzanine, a very nice gift shop. And what's the lady's name?
Dorothy Johnson or Liv Rolson?
Johnson.
Dorothy Johnson.
Rolson.
Well, Dorothy Marshall. Liv
I'm sorry.
Liv
But
Rolson.
she liked to listen to her commercial at night. It was on the news. And I remember this commercial almost by heart because we heard it frequently. It said that at Marshall's gift shop, you'll find a fine variety of hen dishes, plates of all kinds, and it named the different types of merchandise that they had there. But the hen dishes appealed to one of the engineers, so he went in and he made a little carrot like Esther always did, and he wrote rooster pots, goose pans, and so Martin, he took time out on his newscast to do his commercial, and he said, at Marshall's gift shop you will find a wonderful selection of gifts such as hen dishes. And Martin really loved to give it as all, and that was why they asked him to do his commercial. Hen dishes, rooster pots, goose pans. And all of a sudden he stopped and thought, wait a minute here. And he looks up and he sees everybody in the control room leaning on each other, dying of laughter. He blew sky high. Joel Shire was not happy about that at all. We always had a lot of fun, and we're a little more formal now, I guess. Everything is, the commercials are all cut and dried. If you make a mistake with a commercial now, there's no excuse for it, because you have a chance to go back and do it over again. But Bert Berdan and Joel Chandler, who was on television over in Burlington for a while, and he started out at WEAV also. Bert came up to Wyrie some time later, but it was fun in those days, and everybody enjoyed it. Broadcasting. It was about the only reason for doing it, I guess.
Still is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chet. You didn't let me down. You proved you're the gentleman you always were. Haven't lost that over the years. I'm going to introduce the kid last, so I'm going to skip over here to the gentleman on my right. He's got seniority on you, Mike. If Plattsburgh had a Radio Hall of Fame, I think one of the outstanding and one of the top billers would be Gordie Little. I can't believe my father didn't really own Wyrie. Christ, he sent them all the good people there. And the better they were, the faster he sent them. And, you know, some came back and forth, you know, because they wanted to make that big money. But Gordie did start with us, as I understand. I think it was probably before that. I was more interested in other things other than radio, and I was probably smarter in those days than I am today. But I have learned through the years, as when you lose somebody good, you pay for it for a long time. We learned that with Sid Spiegel too. And you don't really appreciate somebody till you have to work against them. But you know, even though we've been competitors for many years, Gordie's certainly a person I respect. He's a person I think who's been awfully good for radio because he's given radio an excellent reputation. When you need something, when this community needs something, you not only get a yes or we can do it, you get a super effort. He's the type of person that he's absolutely the opposite of me. I want to go take a nap and he wants to go do the job. I mean, I don't care if it's laying dimes down Canilla Street and I'm trying to run him over, or whether he's interviewing soldiers coming back from Saudi Arabia. But he doesn't seem to age. His attitude is still as good and as vibrant as ever. He's always there, and if you try to, you know, if you're like in a football game, you could say, well, you know, we're going to put this guy to do this and this guy to do that. And our organization, oh, we're going to have this guy do the news, this guy's going to be program director, and this guy's going to do this and that. And you say, well, who does that for wiring? You put a big bracket around it. Gordie Little does all that stuff, and, you know, and he works 6 days a week. And he told me he's never had a sick day in his life. Even though we tried to follow the air conditioning up there several times, dirty tricks, you know, but he's just that type of individual. He's always there for this community, and he's a person who has made Plattsburgh and Clinton County a better place. It's my pleasure to introduce Gordie Little.
I graduated from college in 1961 on Long Island, and in years before that, I wanted to be a civil engineer and design bridges and do a lot of things, but our lives take strange paths sometimes, and I always admired radio and loved media. Even when I was in college, I listened to radio all the time in New York City. Dreamed someday of perhaps working part-time in the radio business, but as my college career went on, I found out I wasn't any good in physics at all. And I thought maybe since my father had been a minister and I heard public speaking around my house all the time, I thought maybe I'd like to try radio. So in 1961, when I graduated in the first class at Stony Brook, I applied at about 5 radio stations, I think, and WEAV was one of them. And for years after, I saved the telegram that George Bissell Sr. sent me saying, it was addressed to Warden Little. And it asked me to come to Plattsburgh for an audition. And the bus trip from Long Island was $18.75 round trip. And I scraped up $18 and borrowed the 75 cents and made the trip in the middle of the night. And got here about 3 o'clock in the morning and was shocked to learn that WEAV wasn't on the air at that time of the day. So I drank about 40 or 50 cups of coffee at the old Cumberland and walked up here in the morning and did the audition and went to work. The program director at that time was Dave Dewey. And I really got my feet wet at WEAV and worked there for 3 months, and George said, you never will amount to anything. And I still haven't. No. But I went to work at WEAV on July 4th, 1961, and left there on October 19th and went to work at Larry on October 20th. And you know, we get so immersed in the business that we don't take time to reflect. That's why George had to go back and check some of these figures. And it's hard to remember specific dates and times because everything runs together. You do it all so much every day. And you talk about wearing many hats. Back in the 1960s at Larry, we had, I don't know, maybe 22 people on the staff. And earlier this year, we received the Small Business Award, which has to be awarded only to businesses with less than 10 employees. And as it turns out now, we have only 2 full-time announcers on the staff, myself and Bob Pooler. When you think of local radio, though, you think of...
We only have 2 salesmen, too.
That's true, too, and they're both women, by the way. The station manager is a woman. The traffic director and receptionist is a woman. And we do what they say. But when I think back radio, I don't think so much in terms of dates, although I was introduced to Martin Mannix. I unfortunately never got to meet him because he died before I came to work at Wiry, but I did listen to him when I came here to work on the air base on construction in 1955, and knew what he looked like and knew about his reputation. But then I came to work at Wiry in '61, and we were reflecting around the supper table tonight as to how all the radio stations have changed to suit the times and for a variety of other reasons, some of them economic over the years. So that's one of the reasons our staff is so small. As a matter of fact, we still have the same old transmitter that first went on the air at Wiry as an auxiliary transmitter now, which works perfectly well, 250 watt gauge transmitter, which is ready at the flip of a switch anytime to go on the air. We still use the original 1950 Wiry control board in our recording studio, and all the commercials you hear recorded and all the pre-recorded programs are done through that old tube-type board, which generates an immense amount of heat. And all the words you hear spoken on the air are spoken through the ancient and venerable RCA, the microphones, RCA, what is it, DX microphone, the one you see in the old movies. We have 2 of them left, and they're expensive. If you went to buy one used today, you'd pay big bucks for it.
We are truly a historical radio station.
Yeah. But you know, equipment was good. Back in the 1950s, they made tape recorders, which hadn't been invented too many years before that by a guy named Hitler, who wanted to try to convince the people in Germany that he was everywhere. So he had his best engineers come up with a device called a tape recorder, and we sent somebody over there to memorize the circuitry and brought it to this country. But by the time the Ampex Corporation got involved in making tape recording equipment in this country, they were good. And so the Ampex tape recorders, we have 3 of them at Wiry, which have been around for well over 35 years. But equipment was made very well back in those days. But Chet mentioned some of the specific programming in the early days. Now, when I started in 1961, the theory was you play different music at different times of the day to suit the mood of the listener and the audience you thought was listening at that time. But what hasn't been mentioned here, I think, is the fact that prime time, or as we call it, drive time, in the radio business changed with the advent of television. And it was a subtle but sure flip-flop. Whereas Wiry, not Wiry, but radio in general was listened to primarily at night. Suddenly, the prime time for television was at night, and the really important time for listening to radio was in the morning. And it still is for now, the most important time of the day is morning time. But eventually through the years we learned that people generally like to hear the same kind of music in the afternoon as they do in the morning, and so rather than have a separate group of programs for each time of the day, we pretty much do the same kind of thing as long as we're on the air. What George didn't mention in the history, first of all, the date Wiry went on the air on January 30th, 1950 in the afternoon. And the great thing about radio back in those days, we hear these people talking about studios. You had to have fairly large studios because most things were done live. It was difficult to record. When we talk about cutting a record or cutting a commercial, that's what we had to do. We cut it on the big discs that George mentioned, and that wasn't an easy thing. Nowadays, you can rewind a tape recorder. Back in those days, if you messed it up, you threw that one away and started with another one. So that's why things were live and bands were live. we had, there were good-sized studios at WEAV. You had sound lock control rooms with double doors, and I can think of anecdotes involving nameless announcers who got caught in between and all the fun things that happened. But bands were live. When Wiry went on the air, what time was it, about 5 o'clock? 5 in the afternoon. I did all the research and let somebody borrow it and lost all the papers. So, but it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was a grand piano. There were fiddle players and whistlers. What was the lady's name who whistled? She only died about 8 or 10 years ago. Loretta Dixon. Why that name just came back to me, I don't know, but she whistled live. But there was a lot of live music. You didn't play that many records in the beginning, and then eventually you didn't have any more live bands. When I started work at WEAV, we had a lot of live music on the air. Chuck and his country cousins, and Tex Tracy and his trail buddies, and these people would come in, and they were never, ever sober. You never knew what was going to happen, and you were more worried about getting the program on the air, these guys out of there without swearing or do something. But eventually, as the technology advanced, live music didn't sound that good on the radio anymore, and so live bands didn't play anymore, and I always felt kind of sad about that. We tried to revive that right up into the 60s and early 70s for a while, but it didn't do so well. We did a lot of...
didn't sound so good.
Yeah, true. But we did a lot of live concerts. And this was a great way for me to learn the radio business, to do the live remote broadcast. It's something else we haven't mentioned. Chet's done a lot of them, and I've done thousands of them. Go out in the community and talk at a business, describe the product, meet the people involved, and do live concerts. We had a guy by the name of Ray Bushy, who didn't die that long ago, who was a real good promoter, and we had a place called Rollerland, which is now burned down, but it's the Teamsters Hall. Yeah, the building was replaced. It was a mammoth fire in the middle of the night, but we used to pack 1,500 to 3,000 kids in that place and bring all the big rock stars of the day into town. And what an experience for a young radio announcer to MC programs like that and do twist contests and get to meet Brian Hyland and Johnny Tillotson and all the big stars of the day. And they were cheap because they were tuning up their new songs on their way to Montreal. So they'd stop here on a Friday night before doing a Saturday night concert in Montreal, and we'd get to broadcast it live on the radio, and those were great experiences. But when I think back and over my career in radio, I remember personalities, and I remember programs, and perhaps you do too. And if I mention a few names, I'll notice your eyes gleam or glisten when you recall some of those names. And my wife mentioned a name which I almost forgot to remember here tonight, and that's Jack Nazak. Jack is one of the most wonderful people on the face of the earth, and I don't see Jack much anymore. He had a stroke a couple of years ago, but Jack's pushing 90 right now. He lives in Rand Hill, and he's responsible for a lot of the installation of equipment at both radio stations, and but also a fine human being, a good guy to mention. Jack was never on the air, to the best of my knowledge. But he was a great storyteller and also a fine technician. But some other names which you should remember.
He built WEAV, I think, didn't he?
Yes.
I think he did.
Original chief engineer, Channel 5 too, wasn't he?
Yep, absolutely. And the names of the personalities on Wiry, I'll drop a few of the names that haven't been mentioned here tonight, but they should be before we're through. One of them is Lenny Kane. Lenny, I don't think he ever worked at WEAV.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did.
He worked at WENT, which is my father's station in Gloversville before he came up here.
Yeah, that's where we got him.
But there
He's
was
down
a,
in Poughkeepsie now, isn't he?
He's the Chamber of Commerce in Kingston.
Oh.
the great story about Lenny is when, what was the girl's name who tried to swim the lake? And Lenny was enthusiastic as I am about the business and would go anywhere and do anything and always sound chipper on the radio. And he walked out into the lake with a wiry microphone to interview this girl and almost bought the farm. He got the shock of his life.
Going alongside her.
In Don's boat, Don Pelkey's boat.
Yeah, and he was scared to death because the wind was from the south. And that lake was rough. Oh.
But he was also a morning man. The winery was in a state of transition, I think, when I came there. And Lenny Kane, I think, was on the air back in those days. George mentioned Mr. Rogers. That would have been James J. Rogers II.
Henry Rogers.
Henry.
Henry was the father, James the junior.
James Jr. And then James Rogers III worked at WIRY and was on the air when I came there and left. And he went to Saranac Lake and bought WNBZ and is still there. And is a pillar of the community there. And other personalities you might remember, because this guy was bigger than life, was Tiny Hair. We were one of the first radio stations in the United States to send a reporter to Vietnam, certainly one of the first small radio stations to do that. And we had to be nuts, but we talked it over and tried it, and Tiny took a bag of reel-to-reel tapes and a little tape recorder, and he was an ex-Marine, and he always found a way, and went to Vietnam and interviewed almost 400 of the guys and gals from Clinton County there, and it was a tremendously successful program. But Tiny was terrific in many ways. He played with local bands, right, for many years. The best story about Tiny Hair is the fact that I was in the control room with the announcer on the air, and Tiny always, his line was, if I'm going to go, I'm going to go first class. So he brought a client into the Wiry Studios because he was a salesman at the time and went to sell this person something. And we had a trick chair. This chair wasn't in any specific room because it was broken. And why we didn't throw it away, I'll never know, but it sat in the hallway. And Tiny ushered this person in, this business person, and he said, have a seat. And the person had a seat. And the seat was all over the floor. And I was in a corner laughing, and nobody could say anything. And all you could see was Tiny saying, well, we're so sorry. And then there's oh, God, I don't know.
Tiny, you did.
Which station was Dick Carno with? Did you have a Dick Carno?
Yeah, he was the original, one of the original announcers. I'm trying to think of the other fellow's name. When Wiry first went on the air, they had these two. Bassett, his name was, this other man. But Dick Carno lived down in, the thing that impressed me was he lived in Fort Henry or someplace down there, and he came up to open the station in the morning, every morning, all the way from Fort Henry.
You lived in Westport?
Westport.
Because I know his daughter.
I heard the name, but I don't think I've ever met him.
Yeah, he was quite an announcer. As a matter of fact, he had a little stock in the station, and Joel was kind of anxious to get rid of him, but he couldn't.
That's where I heard the story. Somebody mentioned Betty Swift or Betty Krause here, and I'd like to mention Betty in several connections. She was an engineer at one point. She was also the music director and program director at one point. She was the music director when I came to work there. And Chet mentioned Esther Fox and her little carrots. And she didn't know how to spell brazier. The first blooper I ever had on an iron was selling cast iron braziers.
Before your time.
Well, Betty Krause also was a very innovative lady, and she did a show called Woman's World on Wiry. My wife reminded me tonight how much she loved to listen to it. And WEAD and WIRY currently share an engineer whose name is Bob Broadwell, who is a unique personality and a very talented person, and he loves old-time country and western music. And Betty, announcers in those days would sit in a booth and somebody else would often play the music. And so, since nobody else was around on many given days, Bob Broadwell would be her engineer. And she picked these very lively songs on a woman's world, you know, fit the theme. About once a week, Bob Broadwell would sneak in a great old classic called The Little Rosewood Casket. Betty was not friendly to Bob. But Betty Krause also did a program called Wiry Calling. And there was a lady by the name of Alice Potter who worked at Wiry for some time, did a late night show which was popular with the male audience because she had a very sexy style in the hair. And Alice Potter started the Wiry Calling show, and I did it with Alice, and you probably did it on a few occasions.
Many times.
Many times. It was a program that, for those of you who remember it, it was a deal where you would knock on doors. Something you probably wouldn't do today in the business, but you would knock on the door, and if the homemaker was amenable, you'd go in and look for Boulier's bread in the larder, and look for rosebud milk in the refrigerator, and if they had a loaf or a quart, you'd give them one and sit down and interview them. And some of my most humorous and fond memories are of Wiry Calling and the people we'd meet in doing that. I might mention a couple other names, and then I don't want to bore you anymore, but Dick Hildreth was a fine newscaster on Wiry. I don't know what year he came there, but he worked about 8 years before he decided to leave.
He replaced Martin Mannix.
He replaced Martin, and then he worked until...
That was a tough road for him to hoe because people were constantly comparing him to Martin, and they were different as day and night. Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, Dick wasn't so much a commentator on the news as Martin was, but he did invent a program that Chet does today called Listen Here, Plattsburgh. And my friendship with Dick Hildreth was renewed about 2 or 3 years ago when I was at an Associated Press meeting in Albany. And we were introducing ourselves around, and a young television executive from the western part of the state said, "Wiry, does the name Hildreth mean anything to you?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "I married his daughter." So he gave me Dick's address, and we renewed our acquaintance, and Dick is now retired and lives in Florida and worked at Southern Illinois University for a long time training people and keeping old-time radio alive, and sent us 2 Christmas shows, which we played on the air last Sunday, as a matter of fact. And,
while you're naming people, if I may, Gordie, let me interrupt just a moment. I know there's some sponsors, some ex-sponsors here tonight. And they will remember, I'm sure, Clint Sweet was one of the first salesmen that we had at Wiry. And of course, Pat Arthur,
oh, sure,
salesman for years with us. Pat's not well, but she's still with us at any rate. Not with Wiry, I don't mean that.
But anyway, there's been a lot of fun through the years. The radio business is a lot of fun. Most of us who are in the business because we love to be there. I toyed many times with the possibility of changing careers because it's pretty hard to survive on an announcer's salary today as it was many years ago when George Bissell Sr. hired me for $53 a week.
40 for me.
Don Delkey offered me $70 a week. Big time bucks. But you know, we all get along extremely well today, and although we compete for advertising dollars, we have a lot of fond memories, and all the radio stations are tied together in one way or the other by personnel or some other way. And my association with the radio community has been nothing but pleasant through the years from those broadcasts. I asked my wife before I came here, what is her earliest recollection of radio in Plattsburgh? And she remembered a guy whose name I'd never heard before, and probably nobody in the room has, Jack Brenton, who worked for WMFF, who, when my wife was a 12-year-old Girl Scout in 1938, went to Camp Tapawingo and interviewed all the Girl Scouts on the radio on WMFF, and that was big time.
What was his name again?
Jack Brenton, she remembered.
Well, I never heard that.
It's probably still in there tomorrow.
But why we used to broadcast from the beach? Some people remember, I do fondly. A little French boy came to watch me broadcast one day on our Chevy Greenbrier bubble machine that we put together with all the equipment. A lightning storm hit while he was sitting there and went right through the transmitter, and that little boy was running Nord. I doubt if he got into the radio business. But some of the fondest memories, besides the personalities we met and those that have gone unmentioned, are the Wiry Treasure Hunt, the most famous of all the games where we got in so much trouble with people digging up City Hall, ripping pages out of the books in the library, stopping traffic on the Adirondack Northway, ripping the bark off every birch tree from here to Bell, and many other games. And Wiry also did a talk program one time called Opinion. There weren't very many talk shows in this area at the time, and that was a lot of fun. Well, I'm going to stop, except to say that I hope radio stays alive for a long time. Radio is still a very popular medium, and in spite of the fact that we don't know where it's going and what's going to happen to AM radio in our community, at least as far as we're concerned, is still an important part of it. And roughly 97% of all the people in America listen to the radio at some time during any given week. And that's pretty good stuff.
He's done it all, and he's done it very, very well. And I don't think we can ever thank him enough for what he has given to this community. We're down to the kid now. We mentioned he didn't have seniority, but I think if we put your dad and you together, we're going to get some pretty impressive years.
Doesn't work.
I know you have worked. He started selling hot dogs, and then he became one on the radio.
What a line.
He started in play-by-play sports. He's been a news director. He's been in radio sales. He's always been in public relations. He embodies everything good about what you can do for the community. He like Chet and like Gordie, when there's something that has to be done, if you look for volunteers and you come up with the name of Mike Mannix, you're going to have one heck of a worker there, and you're going to have one person who won't say no. And he's got a couple fatal flaws in his character. He roots for the Yankees and the Giants, but and he claims he's never had a bad day, but he's got to come close the last couple of years. But a great story, and I'm not going to get in any tape delays about with you, Gordie, because hopefully only a few people have heard those, and they've got the tapes spirited away someplace. But one of the great stories, Mike is the person who, at least, you know, we didn't get him first, but I think we got him last. You know, after a while, we finally learned what we're doing wrong. And he finished his illustrious sports career with WEAV. But we're out doing a Saranac football game one day, and it was about 12:30, and we were out there early. We had the mobile unit. We were running a generator out there and asphyxiating half the stands because they didn't have power. And I asked Mike if he wanted a cup of coffee and a donut. He said, sure. So I lock the car and I go up to the refreshment stand to get a cup of coffee and a donut. Come back. I've locked us out of the car. And all that's in the car is all Mike's notes and the rosters of both teams. And about that time, it was about 10 minutes before kickoff. What do we do now? I mean, we're out of business. We're not going to broadcast this game. So I ran up and I called my wife, Judy, and I said, you know, please come to Saranac and bring a separate set of keys to the car. I've locked Mike out. All his notes are in there. We're not going to be able to do the broadcast. So I think the kickoff was at 1:30. We usually took the air about 1:20. Gee, you know, gets to be about 1:45, and Judy's not there, and I'm hiding, and Mike is sitting up the stands. I didn't dare look at him because I was so embarrassed, and I figured he was up there pouting. And finally, Judy shows up at 2:15. Judy's a lifelong resident of Clinton County. She was well on her way to Peru. She couldn't find Saranac. She student taught there, but she couldn't find the school. But finally, she shows up. She's got the keys, and I said, Judy, you know, where have you been? She said, well, I got lost, you know. And I said, well, you know, we're losing this football game. She says, what? I've been listening to Mike all the way. He's doing the game, you know. I didn't have a radio. I couldn't hear it. But apparently, he'd done enough preparation that he had the names and the rosters all memorized and is able to do a football game. And I can't conceive, certainly not smart enough to do that myself, how he could have done that. And but he had Judy fooled while she was taking a tour down to the Peru Indians, where having to go back to the Saranac Chiefs. But you can never upset Mike Mannix. I don't know why that is, but he is the type of person who will do anything for you, accept any challenge, and he will do not only a good job, he'll do an excellent job. Mike, what do you have to say?
No, there's a couple of names that have been bandied around. Haven't been bandied around. One that I remember as a kid growing up in town was Hortense Graves, and her junior jamboree shows that she used to have. I can remember we used to go on there. I think we were recruited. Hortense lived down the street. So she got the neighborhood. We couldn't play ball at St. Peter's unless we all went on her show to do something. There was a guy named Jack Romeo was on every other week with his accordion and Smiley Willette. The Lydell family, who ended up out in Severances and Harkness. They were and another one in this area who is just a tremendous broadcaster and given a lot to the radio industry is Ben Everest. He had the Never Rest, Ever Rest, the midnight show. I remember back at the time, Ben had such a very bad eye problem. He used to work the midnight show, and then his ride would show up with either a cop car or somebody to take him home in the morning because he couldn't drive. But Ben has given a tremendous amount to radio. He's helped a lot of kids. He used to run a radio studio and a radio school over on Clinton Street.
Rondak Records?
Rondak Records, yeah. He used to get a lot of these young kids in bands and stuff, get them started.
He started at Wary. That was one that went the other way.
George recruited him. Yeah. George Jr.
See, there are people who work for less.
There was another newsman around who left to go into the ministry, Bob Russo.
Yeah. Yes, Bob Russo.
Yeah. And I'm not, I think
well, a lot of them went into the ministry. We scared the hell out of them.
3 weeks they knew they'd seen the other side. They had to go somewhere else.
Who was it that married Ralph Provost? Was that Hortense?
Winnie, yeah.
Wasn't she with radio also?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Winnie and Hortense were sisters.
Yeah. That's.
And there's nothing that, I know Winnie, she was broadcasting even in the 60s. There's nothing that, she was fearless.
Hortense is doing a commercial for the cart system now. You'll see her on the commercial every now and then.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She lives up on Ruger Street.
Ask Mike what his dog's name was when he was a little boy.
Oh, Larry. And when the fair was, the Clinton County Fair was on, and Larry had a mobile home or something, I was running Dr. Gilroy, who had a kennel out on the military turnpike. There was a litter at the fair, and my father was interviewing something. He gave him the pick of the litter, and we got an Airedale at the time. Airedale, he had better attendance at St. John's than I did.
That dog was all over town.
Oh, yeah. The poor thing was, he was 16 years old and then died. I was overseas in the service. And everybody, all the brothers and sisters were home for the holidays, and that thing was, poor thing was dying. My mother said, "You can't put that to bed till Mike comes home." So I don't know, they put her in a closet and took the dog down and had it put away. But my brother Tim and my brother Tom did it. They had the most miserable Christmas you could ever think, because nobody would talk to them for the whole holiday, because they put the poor dog away when I got home. But I don't know what it would have been like if they'd have waited another 6 months. But I got into it, I guess, just growing up in the industry. But I remember I was always going to take over for Mel Allen down at Yankee Stadium. Once I found out I couldn't hit the curveball, so I knew I had to try something else. But Mel Allen and Red Barber were just two people that I idolized growing up. Of course, when you grew up in a family that was radio, my brother was a Red Sox fan, I was a Yankee fan, and he was for Ted Williams, I was for Mickey Mantle. And the thing was, every time Ted Williams got a hit, he could punch me. And every time Mickey Mantle got a hit, I could punch him, but I didn't know Mickey Mantle was only a rookie and Ted Williams was a seasoned veteran. I got beat to a pulp. But, we used to have some interesting battles, but when it came World Series time, I always had a bet with my father, because he was from Flatbush, born in Brooklyn, and he was a rabid Dodger fan. And the Dodgers could never beat the Yankees.
I remember watching the Dodgers and the Yankees playing. We had a television set up in the studio at Wyrie, and you came up to watch the game. You were the only Yankee fan there. The rest of us were all for the Dodgers.
I think I was the only one in Plattsburgh.
No. That was a series, I think, that Larson pitched the perfect game.
56. The bet with my father always was that if the Yankees would win, I'd get a new glove. But the sad part, the only year they won was the year after he died, and that was the year Padres got the most valuable player in '55. But then when I got home from the service, Lenny Kane was doing sports back, and Sid Spiegel was doing sports back then. But a guy by the name of Ray Blomquist.
Yeah,
was near Ray left town, and he's down in Florida, I think, now, or but yeah, Ray can't come back. No.
Never mind.
Well, it's just certain paperwork. I went to Mr. Pelkey. It was in probably the winter of '66, and there was nobody doing sports in the area, and I said, these kids have got to have something on. They've got to be, it's important for them. So I went to Mr. Pelkey. I said, "I'm going to be your sports man." He goes, "Can you do it?" I said, "Put a tape on him." So I gave him a tape. He says, "Well, I'm not going to pay you." I said, "I don't care." So first game I did was a playoff game. It was Crown Point and Dannemora. It was a CCIL basketball playoff game. It was out at Peru. And they had no way to announce. They didn't have anything. You can't do it. 420 back row. I said, "Tony, I'm going to broadcast your game." He goes, "What do you mean?" "I'm going to broadcast." "Well, where am I going to put you?" "I'll go over there." He said, "No, I got that sold. People are going to sit there." So there was back, the Peru gym. Back then it was a window. It was a classroom that overlooked into the gym. So I was up in the classroom. They had a hole through the wall, so we stuck a microphone through the wall to pick up the crowd noise. I had a microphone in the room with me, and I looked out through the window. It was very quiet where I was, very noisy out where they were. But that was the first game I did. It was back with the Record Twins and Butch Wing and Tommy Welch and all those kids up in Dannemora. Dannemora had a great team that year. And just progressed from then on. And I guess I did it for, I think, 5 years before he finally convinced me to give him $10 a game. But then we started doing a morning show. But at the time I was on the highway selling food for a company. And so we want to have a morning sports show. So I went at 4:30 in the morning to get the sports show ready and then head out on the highway. I remember some of the times with Sid, you had to fight with Sid in the morning. Some of the, I've got to tell you this Sid Spiegel story. There's a million Sid Spiegel stories we can tell you, but this was one morning. Sid comes into the station. He's madder than hell. So I'm saying, "So what's wrong?" He says, "You won't believe what they did to me." Well, what happened? In the early morning when you did the news beat, you went down and You went to the police station, you checked the blotter, talked to the cops who are on duty. Then you went to the fire station, you checked fire control, see if the ambulance went out or the fire went out. You did your little news beat. Well, Sid, back when the radio station, the police station was down in the cellar of City Hall. Sid went down in, he went in to get the news, and he was talking to the cops, and 2 other cops went outside, took his car, and drove it up to the fire station. Because they knew that's where he was going after that. So then they'd have the guys at the fire station call down to Sid and say, Sid, you want us to turn the engine off? Where's your left your carburetors? I haven't even been up there yet. They would do that to Sid about 3 times a week. By the time he came into the radio station, he wasn't in a very good mood. I think probably one of the most classic Sid stories I heard was early in the morning, and Chet, I think you were there with me. And it was, he had the 2A in his radio, right? So if you turn the 2A on the radio, you automatically came into the control room. My God, it's gone! It's gone! Old Humpy's gone! He'd always come out of his house, come down Cumberland Avenue, come over the Smithsweed Bridge, and it was gone. Smithsweed Bridge was gone, and he was
Take quite a detour.
Yeah, oh, he had to go, but he couldn't, it was gone. But those were, there's always been a lot of great times growing up in the radio, and there's like Chet coming into the house and having, I remember Lenny Kane, I just saw Lenny about, 3 or 4 weeks ago. Lenny and I were both at the New York State School Boards Association down in Buffalo. I'm walking down the hall to go to a conference, and I hear this voice. Oh my God, it's Lenny. So I walked into his room, and he was giving a lecture, and I sat. Sure enough, he saw me, and I was dog meat after that. He picked on me the whole time he was giving a lecture, but I hadn't seen Lenny in about 4 or 5 years, but he's doing very well. And it's just good to reminisce for a while. He and my brother Tom see each other a lot down. But there's a lot going on the radio. I mean, poor Judy took a beat on George. We've done games. Did a ball game in Mariah. Now, if you've ever done ball games, you've got to do a ball game in Mariah to live. I've done about, I don't know how many down there. Mariah is way out in the middle of the field. You do everything by telephone line. I've done them standing in the pouring rain on top of a school bus. You've got crepe soles, or you're slipping and sliding, or the snow's blowing. And you did the whole game, you called back and said, how'd it go? And it never went on the air. For an hour and a half, had laryngitis and a cold, and nothing went on the air. We went down with George one week. George had to eat before the game. We came back, we looked down, and there's some kids were playing jump rope with our extension cords. George had to scurry those kids away.
They weren't kids, and I wasn't going to push them away.
One night I did a game. I'd been in Albany. I was dressed probably like this, short sleeve shirt and suit. I came back from Albany. And Emmett Duquette and Mr. Roger LaBelle, they wanted to ride down to the game because this is 1967. MAI had an undefeated football team back then, and Greg Duquette and his son, and Wayne his son, and Lucas and Rabidou and Flynn and Roger LaBelle, and a bunch of these kids were playing. Well, they wanted to ride down. I said, sure, no problem. All the way down, all they did was talk French. And arguing like hell over, every once in a while I'd hear Wayne or Greg or Roger. They were talking about their kids, but it was whose kid was better or who was going to be the star and all that. They never say anything to me. And it was snowing, and here I am, and I'm freezing to death. It was up on top of this bus. Halftime, and Emmett comes up, you want a cup of coffee? I said, oh yeah, I'd love a cup of coffee. I took one drink of that cup of coffee. Whoa! I didn't finish it because I wouldn't be able to finish the game. And then Roger came up and wanted to know if I wanted one. I said, no. I was always good about doing games at mine though, because if it wasn't somebody you brought down, the Skazafavas or the Petrushins or some of those people down there, Izzy Kobel and those guys, they always had nice coffee for you. On the way home, they argued in French all the way back home too.
I'd like to tell a little story about your father doing ball game. this was pretty early in Wyrie's existence, and there was a team here. I don't remember. It was a baseball team.
The majors.
No, they were kids.
Oh.
But anyway, he went down to cover it because they had won the state championship.
That was the Kiwanis Club.
Dodgers.
I was on that team. We played in Schenectady.
It might have been. I don't remember. But he went down to broadcast the game. And everybody was very interested in the game because the kids had made the state championships or something. So it came time for it to be on the air, and in those days you used the telephone line, of course. Still do if you go that far, I guess. But at any rate, he was covering the game apparently, but we couldn't get him on the pick him up. And game time came, and no sound from him at all. And Joel Shire was just going crazy because we had sold this thing to years, you know. I mean, and finally, all of a sudden it came on because we got a hold of somebody down there and told him to go and see what was wrong. But the game was played way out in the field someplace, and it took quite a while for him to get out there. And Martin had been broadcasting away all this time, and he looks over and he sees a kid come up to Jack Mazak, who was the engineer. Jack standing there with his pipe in his mouth, staring off into space. The kid comes up and says something to him, and Martin said, I looked over there and I saw the kid talking to him, and I saw Jack's face get very, very red. He reached over and he switched the transmitter. I could have pelted him. The game was about 2/3 over by the time we got him on the air. He says his face got very red, and he reaches over and just turns the switch.
Well, we lost that game anyway.
Well, you would have won if Jack had had that factor. Didn't you do a game from a ladder too, a hockey game down at Albany Academy?
Yeah, that was in the
first class facilities, right?
The last stint I was doing, the last few games, I was following the St. John's kids in 1990 through the States. We were down in Albany Academy. Everything was all set up, and I finally walk in and I see the guy. Where are we hooked up? He goes, over there. Well, right over there was a plug in the wall, right there. The ice arena was over here. I said, well, how am I going to get to the rink? They just put the line in, and that's where they left it. I didn't know what it was for. So I said, well, what can you get me so I can at least see? He comes back with this about 14-foot wooden ladder. So we've got a wooden ladder there, and the rink is over there, and I'm still on a wooden ladder for 2.5 hours doing hockey. I had my brother Tom with me. We were staying over at his house in Albany, so he came with me. Well, he heard all the noise. Next thing you know, he's standing on the ladder on the other side with me. He's supposed to be down there keeping kids away from the wire. So Fuzzy Bissell, who people might look, Fuzzy's around there with a camera, which is bad news. He's still filtering pictures around town of me on that ladder. But that was an interesting one. Probably the most interesting though is the kids that I got to meet over the years and the families. And to this day, I cherish when the kids come home and we get to talk. I was going to stop a couple years before I finally did, but my daughters yelled at me, said that I couldn't, so I stayed on until 2 more years till after they graduated. But it was funny. The other night, New Year's Eve, about 1:30 in the morning, my wife and I said, let's go downtown and find our daughter. This is true. This is just the other night. So we got the car downtown and went. She probably thought we were checking. We walked in and found her. My God, we found her and about 19 to 20 kids, who, all our high school kids back then. It was. We just sat down. I spent probably an hour and a half just sitting there talking with all those kids I hadn't seen, and every one of them just brought out a lot of memories. It's some of the things that you have in radio too. People always know you by your voice, and then all of a sudden they see you, like, God, that's who that is. But you meet so many. You got involved in so many lives of the kids, and it's really rewarding. You always hear a lot of times the bad parts, but there's so many great kids out there, and they're the leaders for tomorrow. We got a chance to watch them grow. We're in good shape. some good kids out there. I think one of the saddest story of all of my broadcasting, I was doing a newscast, and I had a release from one of the schools on a young person who had won a Bosch and Loom Science Award, National Merit Scholar, and Region Scholars. I mean, so the school put out this release on this. I read it. Boy, before the newscast was over, the phone rang and it was a parent. Where did you get that story? It came from the school. How dare you read that story? Don't you ever read that again, or my lawyer will get... I said, sir, if that was my daughter, I'd be standing on top of the building screaming it out. I'll be so proud of her. It's not your daughter, it's mine, and I don't want her name on the radio ever again. It was one of the biggest shocks I ever had. One of the biggest. And this was somebody who won all kinds of awards. This goes, way back. It just, I've never forgotten.
Yeah, you get that every so often. Somebody.
It was a chance to say something or to read a good story every once in a while. You always seem to have the bad side to read.
We used to say they're all out there, and Wiry's have got them all.
Yeah. But the opportunity to work with the Chets and the Gordies and the Bird Verdans and the George Bissells and the Bob Broadwells and the Poolers and the Ben Everetts, they're all in this community, and they work for different, the guys like Jack LeDuc, who works for Channel 3. But you can pick up the phone at any time, and they're there to help, and they all work together. It's fun.
We've left out some names. I know we've left out many names that I can think of, but maybe we can do it again sometime and catch up on some of those. But it's been great, at least for us, to remember some of the great times and some of the great people that we've
Can we
had.
tell the Gordie story?
Well, on behalf of everyone who's here tonight, we just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules, and especially those of you who have to get up real early tomorrow morning, coming and sharing some of your memories. I would encourage you all, if you'd like to stop and take a look at some of the materials that George brought along, or if you've got specific questions, please stay and come on up and just ask away.
Can I mention one thing, George?
Sure.
It came up. I'll ask you to go back to when did WMFF start? When did they, when was the beginning?
1935, February 3rd.
What's that, a rate card?
No. Some of my
We owe you some spots or something?
my memorabilia.
You still owe her 3
It
spots
was
for Beamer.
it was 1936, I think it was, although I don't have the year down here. But I ran across this little piece of paper not too long ago, talk about memorabilia. Now on this side, in Joel Shire's writing, it said compliments of Spiegels and Shires. And underneath it says, your songs went over big. So I looked at the back, and what I had written, and I think I was in, that was 35, I think this was about 36, but I didn't put the year down. It says, your songs went over big. For singing Blue Moon and Where There's Smoke, There's Fire on the radio, April 5th, on the Shire and Spiegel program, I received a lovely pair of brown pigskin gloves.
Would you like to give us the chorus also?
I'm for.
Sunday morning, Gordie wants you.
I was probably, if it was 35 or 36, I was what?
Easy now.
14 or 15 years old. Let's see, 35 I would have been.
Careful.
Never mind.
You were here.
Yeah, I remember. What a quartet.
And that was when they were in the
WMFF?
Yeah, it became the hunt room actually. When WMFF moved out of the hotel, it became the hunt room.
That was before it became the Greyhound bus stop?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Some of our greatest programs are parties that were never broadcast. If you'd like to see,
Year down.
I have some folders of the